Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to discuss propaganda. We're going to look at some interviews with Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida and presidential candidate, and Democratic Representative Pramila Jayapal. Now let's dive right into it. Propaganda. Information, ideas, opinions, or images, often only giving one part of an argument, that are broadcast, published, or in some other way spread with the intention of influencing people's opinions. The hand that rules the press, the radio, and the screen, and the far-spread magazine rules the country. This is a quote by Learned Hand, a federal appellate judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. So I do have a couple of documents I wanted to show you, but for brevity, I want to just highlight a couple of things, even less than what I had before. So when we talk about propaganda, what's the best example of it? Well, it's Nazi Germany. So here we see a article on Robert Henry Best. So government officials quickly saw that audience was more likely to respond positively to broadcasts from native speakers who had roots in that country. So Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels tailored messages to foreign listeners in an effort to generate favorable impressions of Germany. These broadcasts, now this is important, these broadcasts did not aim to convert listeners to Nazis, but rather to challenge the messages presented by Allied governments. So they had a number of American men and women broadcast from Germany. Next, we move on to this article. This was written October 9th, or put online October 9th. So what's Hamas? This gives you some information on Hamas, how everything happened. But the important part that I want you to see here is the U.S., the UK, the European Union, Canada, and many other countries have designated Hamas as terrorist organizations because of its attacks on Israel, which include kidnapping civilians, conducting suicide bombings, and firing rocket salvos into Israeli cities. Sounds like terrorist activities to me. And later on in the presentation, you're going to hear what Hamas is and what Hamas isn't. And I want you to remember this when it comes to that. So a recent poll by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research based in Ramallah found that nearly a quarter of Palestinians said movements like Hamas were the most positive thing that has happened to the Palestinian people since 1948. So 25%. Then we move on to the paragon of information, Wikipedia. You take everything in Wikipedia with a grain of salt, but they have some good things here that I wanted to point out. So many organizations that have been designated as terrorists have denied using terrorism as a military tactic to achieve their goals.
Surprise, surprise, surprise.
And there is no international consensus on the legal definition of terrorism. So there's no international consensus on the legal definition of terrorism. That's important. Organizations currently officially designated as terrorist organizations by various groups. So we're going to scroll down. I've cut this article up so you can I wouldn't have to scroll through the whole thing. But Hamas and Hamas Al-Qassam brigades, they're listed as terrorists. But who lists them as terrorists? European Union, Australia, Canada, Israel, Japan, Paraguay. So what you're going to see on here is who's not on here. So now we're not looking at who is, but who is not. And who is not on here? The United Nations. Why? Well, there's no consensus on the definition of terrorism, but guess who actually has a definition of terrorism? You're correct. It's the United Nations. So this is Resolution 4960, Measures to Eliminate International Terrorism. And we scroll down, and we're going to see what they call terrorism. So the states members of the United Nations solemnly reaffirm their unequivocal condemnation of all acts, methods, and practices of terrorism as criminal and unjustifiable. Then we scroll down to what their criminal acts. Criminal acts intended or calculated to provoke a state of terror in the general public, a group of persons or particular persons for political purposes, are in any circumstances unjustifiable. Whatever the considerations of a political, philosophical, ideological, racial, ethnic, religious, or any other nature that may be invoked to justify them. Sounds like a pretty encompassing definition of terrorism and criminal acts leading that were provoke a state of terror. So this is what the UN defines it. How about we just now use the UN definition for terrorism? But it goes on. In this article, this is after the October 7th massacre. UN still does not label sanctions Hamas's terror group despite murderous attacks. As Israel reels from the deadliest terror attack in years by Hamas, the United Nations Security Council still does not recognize or sanction Hamas as a terror group. The Israeli ambassador slams UN Council statement criticizing Israel. How many murdered Jews does it take? It gets better. The UN insists these are legitimate political movements and therefore can freely work with them. Are you kidding me? Definition of terrorism: criminal acts intended or calculated to provoke a state of terror in the general public. Whatever the considerations of political, philosophical, ideological, racial, ethnic, religious, or any other nature that may be invoked to justify them. I think now is the time for the UN to designate Hamas as a terrorist group. Let me know what you think. So we're going to move on. If you want to know what propaganda looks like, just turn on your local news. Turn on your local news and listen to what's going on and listen to what they say. So let's move on and see what the local news has to talk about.
Israel suffered the most horrendous assault imaginable by Hamas. I saw that up close. But I've also been in that region. I know there are many people there who simply don't believe it. And they look at what's happening in Gaza now. Is Israel losing the information battle internationally? The Gaza Health Ministry, run by Hamas, says more than 8,000 have now been killed there, including 3,200 children, a figure the Israelis dispute.
Is Israel losing the information battle? I would say it's likely, as long as Western media outlets continue to air footage and report information provided by the Hamas-controlled Gaza Health Ministry, then yeah, probably going to lose the information battle. Think about it. There are no journalists in Gaza. So any information coming from this region should be viewed with a healthy bit of skepticism. This information is provided by Hamas and is Hamas propaganda brought to you courtesy of your local news media outlets. So now on to the interviews. You will notice a distinct difference on how the politicians answer or fail to answer the questions. You'll also notice a difference on their views on how to handle the terrorist attacks on Israel.
Would you urge Israel to slow its current offensive to allow for the release of more hostages and for more humanitarian aid to get into Gaza?
I would support Israel's right to end this problem once and for all. Obviously, we have an interest in the hostages being rescued. I would work with them. I would look at the intelligence to see what our options are there. And of course, we have a strong interest there. But Israel is facing an enemy that wants nothing less than another Holocaust. They would eliminate Israel from the map if they could. Hamas would drive every Jew into the sea. So I think it's important for the United States, or one of our strongest allies, that we stand with them publicly and privately, in word and in deed, because I think if they do anything else than eliminate Hamas entirely, they're just going to face these types of attacks again in the future.
There's no doubt that DeSantis supports Israel. He recognizes the continuing threat that Hamas poses and agrees with the Israelis' conclusion that the only option is the elimination of Hamas. I'd like to point out that this is the exact stance that we took when dealing with Al-Qaeda. We must never forget. This war began October 7th, 2023, with the murder, rape, burning of civilians, beheading of babies, ripping babies from their mother's wombs, and taking hostages. This was a plan devised and executed by the terrorist group Hamas. So let's move on.
What would your message be to Israel in terms of defending itself, but also trying to mitigate civilian deaths, which are already estimated to be in the thousands?
Well, on the humanitarian aid, I've not been supportive of sending that to the Gaza Strip simply because Hamas will commandeer that money. And if you look at what Israel's facing now with dealing with Hamas, there's been a lot of money that's gone to the Gaza Strip for humanitarian purposes since Hamas took power. Did they use that money to make life better for the people in the Gaza Strip? No, they used it to build a massive terrorist infrastructure. They have elaborate tunnels. They have all these things put in place that they've used to launch rocket attacks for many, many years, and of course, launch the barbaric attack on October 7th. So Hamas is the problem here. And I think Israel's taken great pains to warn people to get out if you're a civilian casualty. Hamas takes great pains to try to get them to stay so that they can use them as human shield.
Civilian injury and death is not a new concept in war. Hell, they even got a name for it. It's called collateral damage. Now, from what we've seen so far, one side, Israel, is attempting to mitigate those civilian injuries and death. But the other side, Hamas, is attempting to eliminate every Jew and every Israeli from existence. This means kill them when and if they get the opportunity. Next is an issue that I think should be addressed across the country. Taxpayer dollars funding college groups supporting terrorist groups recognized by the United States government. Now, you can have whatever opinion you want, however repugnant it may be, but my tax dollars should not have to fund them.
This week, you called for the banning of pro-Palestinian groups from Florida state colleges. Your Republican challenger, Vivek Ramaswamy, says that violates the First Amendment rights of these students. He writes, quote, "It's a shameful political ploy. It's unconstitutional. It's utter hypocrisy for someone who railed against left-wing cancel culture." What is your response to Mr. Ramaswamy?
This is not cancel culture. This group, they themselves said in the aftermath of the Hamas attack that they don't just stand in solidarity, that they are part of this Hamas movement. And so, yeah, you have a right to go out and demonstrate, but you can't provide material support to terrorism. They've linked themselves to Hamas, and so we absolutely decertified them. They should not get 1 red cent of taxpayer dollars. And we also have strong laws in Florida against fundraising for groups like Hamas, and we are enforcing those vigorously. It's not a First Amendment issue. That's a material support to terrorism issue.
Evil has many faces, and sometimes it is difficult to perceive. But on this day, October 7th, 2023, it was in plain view for all to see, wearing no masks, no disguise, daring those to speak its name. Well, its name is Hamas, and those who support evil in any form are weak of will, weak of mind, and bereft of morality. Now we're going to hear from Representative Pramila Jayapal, and we're going to see how the pendulum swings completely in the other direction. In the interview, the last question she asks, I've transposed it and put it into the first question that you're going to see. It's because I think this question is very important, and it should have been brought up first so that you can see where her mind is when it comes to this issue and Israel.
Let me ask you about some of your comments. You have characterized Israel as a, quote, racist state. After a backlash, you clarified that you don't believe the existence of Israel is racist, but that the government engages in racist policies. Can you explain clearly, what do you mean by that, Congresswoman?
I clarified that what I meant is that the existence of Israel is absolutely legitimate, and I think the world has come to see it as legitimate. However,
so I had to stop it. The question is, basically, in the past, she has characterized Israel as racist, and she's had to clean that up. She says existence of Israel is legitimate, and the world has come to see it as legitimate. Now, the word, however, in a sentence like this introduces a contrasting idea or thought. So, Israel is legitimate. However, now let's listen to her answer.
However, there are racists within the Netanyahu government, and there are racist policies that Israel has been carrying out.
So this is how she cleans it up. The world believes Israel is legitimate. However, there are racists within the Netanyahu government, and racist policies Israel has been carrying out. I don't see how you clean anything up there. This is what I think. She clearly believes Israel is not legitimate and continues to promote a racist narrative without providing any proof or examples. She never names anybody, and she never gives us an example of a racist policy. So one could also say that we have racists within the United States government.
Do you believe there's a non-military solution to the crisis that would neutralize the terror threat from Hamas and also bring home the hostages?
Well, Kristen, I called for a ceasefire or at minimum a cessation of hostilities about 12 days ago. And in that time, since the beginning of this horrific war, what we have seen is now, in addition to the 1,400 Israelis who were killed, in addition to the hostages that have been taken, hundreds of hostages that have been taken by Hamas, what we are now seeing is 8,000 Palestinians who have been killed by Israeli airstrikes, 3,000 of whom are children. We have watched 120 premature babies who are likely to die without the fuel to run their incubators. And we see 50,000 pregnant women in Gaza who are going to either have to deliver their babies or die, but about 150 babies being delivered every day without food, water, or fuel.
So the question, do you believe there's a non-military solution to the crisis that would neutralize the terror threat from Hamas and also bring home the hostages? So what does she do? She says, I call for a ceasefire. A ceasefire, cessation of hostilities. What's the fucking difference? There's no difference. Ceasefire, cessation of hostilities, when she says truce, they're all the same thing. You're just trying to rebrand what it is, so maybe somebody will agree with it if you put another name on it. But anyway, what she does next is she does mention the deaths of 1,400 Israelis and a couple of hundred hostages. She doesn't say who kills them. And since then, we have learned from Israel that 1,400 deaths has been reduced to 1,200. Then she goes on and she starts talking about 8,000 Palestinians, 3,000 of which are children, which died in Israeli airstrikes. So she damn sure knows who killed the Palestinians. Then she says there's 120 premature babies, 50,000 pregnant women, 150 babies will have to be delivered every day. These are some pretty specific numbers, considering we don't have anybody inside Palestine giving us these numbers other than the health ministry, which is Hamas. So my question is, how is she getting these numbers? How is she so precise with these numbers? And she's just throwing them out there like they're fact.
Congresswoman, as the New York Times points out today, Hamas is actually sitting on a lot of that fuel, food, and aid that you referenced. Their headquarters is underneath that hospital there. So ultimately, they are the ones who are depriving the civilians of Gaza of all of those necessary aid items that you referenced. If there were to be a ceasefire, what's the guarantee that Hamas would abide by it, Congresswoman?
Well, look, Kristen, first of all,
so the host recognizes in this question that Hamas is sitting on the aid that has been sit over there. So it's not getting out to the people. And she asked, if there's a ceasefire, what's the guarantee the aid's going to get to the people? There is no guarantee. You send aid over there, Hamas is going to be in charge of it, and they're going to do with what they want to do with it. She says, first of all. First of all means I'm going to talk for a while, and I hope you don't recognize that I'm not going to answer your question.
Nobody has any love for Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization that has deprived the Palestinian people, absolutely, of many, many things in the time of their rule. And let's not forget that the last election where Hamas was elected was 16 years ago. Half of Palestinians are children. They were not part of that. And Hamas is not Palestinians, and Palestinians are not Hamas. We have to be very clear about that.
And she says, Hamas are not Palestinians. She wants to make it clear. Hamas are not Palestinians, and Palestinians are not Hamas. Well, I don't want to argue with her, but Hamas is the government of Gaza. They were elected. I'm not sure how their elections go over there, but I know most places you have to be a citizen of the place that you're going to be elected in. So I guess you would have to be Palestinian. Maybe they're not all Palestinian, but to say that none of them are Palestinian is probably a lie. So what you could say is Palestinians are not Hamas, but Hamas may be Palestinians. So there could be some Palestinians within Hamas, but not all of them. And there could be some Palestinians that align with Hamas, which from the PDF we saw earlier, 25% of them agree with it, but not all of them. So that's just a blanketly false statement there at the end.
Senator John Fetterman, a fellow progressive, said, quote, now is not the time to talk about a ceasefire. He added, quote, Hamas does not want peace. They want to destroy Israel. We can talk about a ceasefire after Hamas is neutralized. Going back to that original question, how do you neutralize Hamas? What's your response to Senator Fetterman?
My response is that we need immediate, sustained humanitarian aid to flow into Gaza. We need the bombings, and you can call it a humanitarian truce.
So even a senator from her own party says a ceasefire is not the way to go. But yet she still says, I think we need aid into Gaza. And we already know that Hamas is not going to let the people have the aid. They're going to sit on it, or they're going to sit on as much as they can. Then she says, once again, she's asking for a truce, whatever you want to call it. It's rebranding is what I call it. It's rebranding the word ceasefire into something else in the hopes that somebody will agree with you. And it's not going to work. Now, she prattles on. She prattles on in every answer she gives. But I'll guarantee you, if you go back and watch the full video, you're going to see that she doesn't answer one question. She just tells you the narrative that she wants you to hear, and she ignores the question altogether. So the next two clips, I'm going to play them back to back and not talk in between them. So this is going to be how each one of them defines a double standard in this situation. So let's go ahead and roll the clips, and then I'll come back and speak to it after that.
But I think it's a double standard here when Hamas can go in and massacre babies, massacre elderly people, rape and mutilate. And it's almost like, actually, you have people in the United States that are siding with Hamas in the streets and cheering that. You don't hear much there. But then all of a sudden now it's Israel is under the microscope for everything they do. Hamas can end this by releasing the hostages and unconditionally surrendering. So they are choosing to put people through this. There's no way that they can do what they did and not expect to have a very, very severe response.
This is a double standard. The United States rightly called out Russia for its siege of Ukraine. rightly called out the attacks on the power infrastructure, the refusal to provide food and water and fuel to the Ukrainians. And we have to recognize that our credibility and our authority on the moral stage is greatly diminished if we do not also call out this siege that Israel is launching on Gaza as violations of international law.
So here we have a man who recognizes the differences in the reaction to what Hamas did and what Israel's doing. And he comes from in my opinion, a position of strength. Juxtapose that with her. She comes from a position of weakness. She calls out the siege Israel launched on Gaza as violations of international law. Are you fucking kidding me? There would be no siege were it not for Hamas attacking mass murder, rape, beheadings, burnings, mutilations, and kidnapping by Hamas. These are not military tactics. They're terrorist tactics. That's one difference right there. Secondly, she's comparing this theater of war to a completely different theater of war. Circumstances completely different in either one. You can't compare the two. They're completely different. To me, that's just idiotic. They each have a narrative they're giving. Like I said, I think he's coming from a position of strength, and her narrative is coming from a position of weakness. Now, you can characterize it however you want. But you can even say, one could say that this video is propaganda. I've edited it down to what I want you to see. But the difference between this and what she's doing, especially, is I'm going to link this entire video in the description. So you can go there and you can see exactly what she said and what she didn't say. And then you can judge yourself. If you like this video, hit the like button. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. And we'll see you next time. Peace out.